I played every Darksiders game from start to finish, and by the end of it, I came to one conclusion. This franchise has no idea what it wants to be, but honestly, that's the best part about it. How often do we see a single franchise switch it up as much as Darksiders does? We got a mix of your tried and true hack and slash with a bit of God of War and Zelda like mechanics. Then you got Darksiders 2 expanding its scope big time and going with a semi open world approach with a hint of Diablo like loot. Darksiders 3 throws a bit of Souls like at you, and Darksiders Genesis changes everything by going top down. I mean, you gotta love it. What's more interesting is that this franchise has been passed around from studio to studio, with a total of 3 different studios having what's essentially their own take on the franchise. In this video, I'll be reviewing each and every game, so grab a snack or maybe just get ready to fall asleep. Alright, I should establish how this series works. Darksiders 1, 2, and 3 have stories that run concurrently. You'll see what I mean by that in a little bit. Darksiders Genesis, however, is a prequel to the entire series, but was the most recently released game, and by recent, I mean like 6 years ago. That being said, I'll cover the games in the order they were released, so let's get started with Darksiders 1. The first Darksiders establishes some very important narrative and backstory, which goes something like this. Heaven and Hell have been in an endless war since the dawn of time. This war was raging for so long that it eventually drew the attention of the Charred Council, an entity that's bound by some ancient laws to help preserve order and balance. One side winning would be against the Charred Council's ultimate goal of keeping any great power from going unchecked. In order to actually maintain this order, the council recruited some enforcers, and we know them as the Four Horsemen. Disobeying the council meant a visit from one or all of the horsemen. As time went on, a new kingdom would start to emerge, the Kingdom of Man. The council deemed that the Kingdom of Man would eventually be integral to the balance, but for now, they are far too weak. A truce was forged between Heaven and Hell, and this pact was bound by 7 seals. The 7 seals are meant to be broken, but only when the Kingdom of Man was ready for the End War. This End War would establish some new balance and determine the fate of the 3 kingdoms, Heaven, Hell, and Man. And the 7th seal breaking would also call forth the 4 horsemen to battle. Alright, that's out of the way. The first game in the series follows War, and War also ends up being the only of the 4 horsemen to appear in 2 games, this one and Darksiders Genesis. War is duty bound. He is all about upholding justice and probably the most stoic dude in the universe. Unfortunately for him, he's been accused of starting the End War prematurely since the Kingdom of Man was not ready for it, and in the eyes of the Charred Council whom he serves, he's more in a guilty until proven innocent kind of situation. Throughout the game, the goal is to get to the bottom of who was really the one to trigger the End War so that War can be acquitted. I'll swing back around to the story towards the end of the Darksiders 1 section, but I first want to talk about how the game actually plays. Darksiders 1 is very much a product of its time. The gameplay and combat resemble the early God of War titles, but truthfully, outside of just the combat, Darksiders has some really unique stuff going on that I came to appreciate over time. But first, let's go ahead and talk combat. The game is very much your standard hack and slash affair. You got your basic light attacks, your heavier attacks, a dodge mechanic, and some abilities to go along with it. War's main weapon is the Chaos Eater, a giant great sword that War wields effortlessly. But the combat really starts to open up once you get your hands on secondary weapons like the Scythe and the Gauntlet. The Scythe is honestly a ton of fun to use. It's great for crowd control. It just feels satisfying to swing around, and it's a much faster weapon than the Chaos Eater. The Gauntlet, on the other hand, is slower, but it hits like a truck, and it's perfect for knocking down bigger enemies that like to tank through your normal attacks. You also get the Crossblade, which works as a ranged option, and it's not going to be doing any sort of crazy damage, but it's useful for picking off flying enemies or hitting things from a distance. On top of all that, you've got your Chaos Form, which basically turns War into some massive demon that just plows through everything for a limited time. Every Darksiders game has its own version of this. Now, is the combat deep? Honestly, it depends on how much you're willing to put time into it. There's a combo system underneath it all that I didn't really study or explore too much, admittedly, but it felt like it was inspired by the Devil May Cry series. Obviously not that in depth, but there's some real variety of moves that you can pull off. Playing the game on normal difficulty meant that I didn't really need to put out all the stops to get past encounters, and I can't speak of what the experience might be like on the hardest of difficulties, but Who knows, maybe the combo system becomes much more relevant. The game felt challenging without ever feeling overbearing, and there wasn't a single section of the game where I felt like things were unfair or stacked up against me. The combat system is solid and a good first attempt. We'll be seeing the combat system evolve over the series. Now, Darksiders 1 has this post-apocalyptic Earth setting where demons have completely taken over. The game does a really good job of selling that. While War was imprisoned by the Charred Council, the demons were busy. You've got ruined cities, crumbling highways, and the demons have built up entire towers. Some areas, especially the early ones, are kinda bland in my opinion. It's just a bunch of gray and brown color palettes, which was pretty damn common in gaming during that generation, and Darksiders really leans into that, at least in some of the earlier sections of the game. It definitely gave me some Infamous and Prototype vibes. What I appreciate is that the game doesn't just stick you in destroyed cityscapes for the entire 15 hours. Each major area has its own distinct look and feel. The Twilight Cathedral has this dark, gothic atmosphere to it, and it was just a joy to explore. The Ashlands are wide open and hostile and dotted with demon outposts that exist only to avoid the sandworms. Anvil's Ford has a completely different energy, almost like a lush forest thrown in the middle of a hellscape. And Eden, toward the end of the game, is genuinely beautiful. I have to give a shout out to the level designers because some of these places just look really good, and that's even by today's standards. Now, let's talk a little bit about the gameplay mechanics. The game has this structure where almost every major area rewards you with a new power or a new tool. You'll come across these floating devices, and once you clear out the enemies guarding them, you get something new to play with. Early on, you get the crossblade, which I already mentioned for combat, but it also doubles as a puzzle solving tool. And my god, does this game have a ton of puzzles. I'll come back to that in a bit. But you can imbue the crossblade with fire by aiming at a flame or letting it pass through a target, and this mechanic returns in Darksiders Genesis, but on a much smaller scale. Later, you get the gauntlet, which lets you smash through these blue crystals that were blocking your path for quite some time. Then there's this chain, which lets you grapple onto hook and swing across gaps, and it also rips off shells of certain enemies. The Chronosphere lets you slow down time while you move at a normal speed, which is crucial for crossing areas like the Ashlands where giant worms will kill you the second you touch the sand. And then towards the end of the game, you get an ability called the Voidwalker, which is basically like a portal gun. You shoot portals onto these orange surfaces and use them to launch yourself across the room or redirect beams of light for puzzles. Obviously, this progression structure isn't a new thing. We've seen it many times in different titles, but I think Darksiders actually does a really decent job at constantly providing something new to do. You go into a new area, you get a new item, then you use that item to solve the puzzles in that area, or you use it to beat the boss later on. Each new tool does make it feel like the game is expanding, and going back to earlier areas with these new abilities and finding things you couldn't access before is always satisfying. A lot of areas often have smaller explorable side pockets prior to entering a main dungeon. You can explore off the beaten path to find chests and collectibles or upgrades that make War's health pool or wrath pool larger. I like that the levels weren't just completely linear, and often my curiosity and effort was rewarded. The game is structured around these dungeon-like areas, each one built around whatever new power you just picked up. You go in, you solve puzzles using that power or a combination of a few powers toward the later half of the game. You fight through enemies, and at the end there's a boss waiting for you. Now, it's very important to mention that about 50% of this game, if not more, is all about puzzle solving. It's not something I expected when I first started, but every time I came across one, I knew I just had to lock it in. Some actually require some complex solutions, namely the ones towards the end game where you have a ton of powers at your disposal at once. Early on, you might just need to throw a bomb at some red crystals, but by the time you're in the Black Throne, you're using Voidwalker portals to redirect beams of light across multiple rooms, and the puzzles demand a lot more from you, and my patience, to be honest, was starting to wear a bit thin towards the end game. I came in expecting a combat heavy experience, but there were times I'd go upwards of 30 minutes without a single combat encounter. Outside of puzzles, there's also a decent amount of platforming. War can scale walls of demonic growth, he can hang on pipes and wires to move between platforms, and later on you're swinging across gaps with a chain. It's nothing crazy, but it works, and it helps breaking up the pacing between the combat and the puzzle solving. War controls pretty well, though it can be annoying to be clearly lined up with a grabbable edge and just still miss it. Now, the one thing about the mission structure that I have to call out is the crazy amount of repetition or filler, which by the way is even worse in Darksiders 2, but we'll get there soon enough. The game loves to ask you to do things in sets of 3 or 4. We need to close 4 shadow gates. We need to kill 4 chosen. We need to eliminate 4 spiders to open a door. Even the shadow gates themselves are basically combat arenas with specific conditions, such as kill 5 enemies in midair, kill 40 enemies within a time limit, and so on. It's not that any individual task is bad, but when you start to see the pattern, it does start to take away from the experience a little bit. Anyway, let's move on. Darksiders 1 does introduce new enemy types at a pretty steady pace, which I really appreciated. Early on, you got your standard demons that go down without much trouble, and they only really exist to get you familiar with the combat system, but it's not long before the game starts throwing bigger threats at you. There's this flaming giant who hits very hard and also likes to explode when he dies. Then you've got this giant blue demon with horns who has a mix of range and melee attacks. Later on, you run into these armored enemies that take forever to kill, but the cool part is seeing their armor fly off as you hit them. In Silith's realm, you got these dual blade wraiths that attack fast and hurt quite a bit, but thankfully the gauntlet is perfect for knocking them down. I like that certain weapons and tools felt more effective against certain enemy types. It gave me a reason to actually switch things up instead of just spamming the same attacks over and over on everything. The constant stream of new enemy types as I went into these different areas was great. It really helped keep things interesting. There are some parts of the game where the entire experience is flipped on its head, and I thought these sections were both so random and so fun at the same time. Darksiders goes from this hack and slash to a third-person shooter using a cannon to gun down hordes of enemies, which I thought was just hilarious. Overall though, I think the enemy variety does its job. There's enough variation to keep you on your toes across the different areas, but now we need to talk about the bosses. Now, Darksiders has a decent amount of mini bosses that sort of block off sections of the dungeons that we need to get to, and these bosses aren't all that difficult, nor are they that interesting, but the 4 chosen are entirely unique and range from really cool to really bland. The Tiamat fight is solid and has a few mechanics that need to be done in succession, like throwing these fire bombs and activating them with a flame via the crossblade. Doing this drops Tiamat, opening up the opportunity for some melee attacks. The environment that the fight took place in was awesome, and there was a sense of scale to it. But unfortunately for me, I feel like that's probably the best boss fight in the game. The Griever fight is all right. It's a really simple mechanic where you just need to push these train carts into the weak spot and attack the opening over and over again. Overall, it's a pretty easy fight. The big worm fight was fine. The only issue was that it was a clone of a fight that you do earlier in the same level, except you need to use a little bit of melee. And then Silitha was also solid. The grapple hook needed to be used to close the gap on her, but that's basically it. Each main boss sort of has its own gimmick or mechanic that I needed to repeat over and over again, even down to the final boss, the Destroyer. Truthfully, these mechanics don't make the fights difficult, but instead they make them more tedious. I would have much preferred just straight up one-on-one fights, but this is something that's addressed thoroughly in the rest of the Darksiders series. Alright, so let's close the gap on the story of the first game, which in all honesty is really well done. I won't be overly detailed here, but I'll give a good rundown. If you want to see a detailed playthrough, you can check out my trilogy video. We already know that War has been sent back to Earth to clear his name. And along with that, he's got this watcher bound to him that basically acts as a snitch for the Charred Council. Earth has been completely overrun, humans are all but extinct, and demons have taken over. But the real meat of the story comes from the characters that War meets and the layers that get peeled back as you go. Early on, War is pointed towards Samael, a powerful demon who was imprisoned for being a threat to the Destroyer. This won't be the last game we'll be seeing him in either. Samael tells War that to get to the Destroyer's tower, he needs to take down 4 of the Destroyer's chosen and bring back their hearts. War doesn't really have much of a choice at this point, so he just goes along with it. Along the way, War also runs into Uriel, the enforcer of Heaven's army on Earth. She blames War for the end war and the death of her leader, Abaddon. At one point, she pledges a death oath called the Next Sacramentum, meaning one of them will eventually have to kill the other. For a good chunk of the game, the loop is just hunting down a chosen, ripping out its heart, and bringing it back to Samael. But once you deliver the final heart, things start to take a bit of a turn. Turns out the chosen weren't guarding the tower at all. Instead, they were preventing Samael's return. So War unknowingly restored one of the most dangerous demons in existence. Strangely, Samael keeps his word and grants War access to the tower so he can deal with the Destroyer as promised. Inside the tower, War frees Azrael, the Angel of Death, and this is where the real truth starts to come out. Abaddon, the leader of Heaven's army, conspired with Azrael to break 6 of the 7 seals and launch a surprise attack on Hell without the Council's approval. They left the 7th seal intact so the Horsemen would not be summoned, and had Ulthane and the Old One reforge the broken seals to cover up the evidence. The plan went sideways, Abaddon fell in battle and was offered a deal to become the very thing he was fighting against. Abaddon is and has been the destroyer the entire time. War learns of all this through the Tree of Knowledge in Eden, where he sees a vision of exactly how Abaddon was turned. On top of that, we also learn that the Charred Council knew something was wrong and deliberately sent in War, and only War, because they needed someone who wouldn't question an order. They used him because they didn't want to admit that they lost control. War pieces together the Armageddon Blade with the help of Ulthane, the only weapon capable of killing Abaddon, and heads to confront the Destroyer. After taking him down, War eventually acquires the 7th seal. War breaks the 7th seal, calling his fellow horsemen to ride, and that's the end of Darksiders 1. There are a lot of moving pieces, but I think the story does a really good job of keeping you guessing, and that final stretch where everything comes together is genuinely satisfying. It's not the kind of narrative you would expect from a hack and slash game from 2010, and I think that's what makes it stand out in my opinion. The ending of the game, I believe, sets up Darksiders 4 because Darksiders 2 and 3 take place during the same time frame. So where does Darksiders 1 land for me? Well, this is a game from 2010 and it does show its age in some areas, but that's just unavoidable. The early environments are a bit dull, the combat isn't going to blow anyone away, and the formula of entering a dungeon, getting a new item, and using it to solve puzzles and beat the boss does start to feel a bit predictable by the back half. But honestly, I had a great time with it. The environments get better and better as the game goes on, the progression system kept me engaged from start to finish, and the story ended up being way more interesting than I had expected it to be. It's not a perfect game by any means, but it does a lot of things well, and it sets the foundation for a franchise that's about to completely reinvent itself. Speaking of which, let's move on to Darksiders 2. Darksiders 2 would release on August of 2012, just 2 years after the first game. Imagine getting a sequel that quickly these days. It was developed by the same studio, Vigil Games, and that's some important context because this is the last game they'll develop. Now here's where the timeline stuff I mentioned earlier comes into play. Darksiders 2 doesn't pick up after the events of the first game, it actually runs alongside of it. While War is off on Earth dealing with the Charred Council's accusations, his brother Death is on his own mission happening at the same time, and this mission wasn't given by the Charred Council. Death believes War is innocent, but unlike War, who's trying to clear his name through the Council's mission, Death takes a completely different approach. His goal is to resurrect humanity entirely, essentially undoing the crime that War is accused of so that the charges become irrelevant. If there's no dead humanity, then there's no crime. It's a bold plan and it tells you a lot about who Death is as a character. Where War was a stoic, duty-bound soldier, Death is more of a loose cannon. He's sarcastic, he's arrogant, and more willing to engage in banter, but he's someone who clearly cares for his own kin. He's one of the more entertaining horsemen in my opinion. I'll be closing the gap on the story towards the end of the Darksiders 2 section. So remember when I said Darksiders 2 plays almost nothing like the first game? I wasn't exaggerating. The first thing you'll notice as soon as you start playing is how different Death moves compared to War. War was heavy. He was a tank, and he wasn't the most agile person during many of the platforming sections, which was a bit frustrating at times. Death, on the other hand, is fast. He's agile, and the game leans hard into that. There's a full parkour system here. Death can wall run, he can climb, he can traverse environments in ways that War never could. It makes getting around feel way more fluid, and honestly, it's a pretty big upgrade in terms of moment-to-moment gameplay. The world itself is also structured differently. Darksiders 1 was more of a connected map where you'd unlock shortcuts and serpent holes to get around, but Darksiders 2 opens things up significantly. You've got these large areas that connect to multiple dungeons, and there are NPCs scattered around that hand out side quests. It's just a much bigger game overall. The other change is the loot system. Darksiders 1 had a pretty straightforward progression system. You get your set weapons and your upgrades, but that's about it. Darksiders 2 throws all that out and goes for a full action RPG. Enemies drop gear, chests have randomized loot, and you're constantly swapping out weapons based on stats. If you've played Diablo or really any loot-driven game, you know exactly what that feels like. Being a fan of looters in general, I couldn't be more happy. One of the biggest changes to me was the feel of combat, and this was a positive change in my opinion. Death's primary weapon is his scythe, and right away you can feel the difference. Where War's combat was heavy and deliberate with slow but impactful swings, Death is all about speed and being fluid. The attacks come out fast, the combos chain together smoothly, and the whole thing just feels more responsive and quick. On top of the scythe, Death gets a secondary weapon slot that pulls from a loot pool of weapons available, and there's a good amount of variety here. So you might be rocking a massive hammer for 1 minute and a pair of claws the next, depending on what gets dropped. These weapons add new move sets and combos to pull off. This also adds a layer to the combat that the first game just didn't have because your loadout is constantly changing based on what you find. It might sound like I'm ragging on the first game at this point, but that's not the case at all. I like the combat of the first title, I just think the second one improves on it in every way. The game does have your standard rarity system, with the more rare weapons having more attributes associated with them, such as a greater crit chance, elemental damage types, and so on. It's a nice layer of complexity that gave me the opportunity to test out different builds. There's also a skill tree system that lets you spec into two different paths, one that's more focused on melee and the other on summoning and necromancy basically. So you can either lean into being this up close damage dealer or have some skeletons doing some of the work for you. I ended up going the summoner route and did not regret it. My skeletons taunting the bosses while I did all the damage was a big part of my strategy. I liked how the gameplay felt in this game. I do wish the later games continued to expand on it, but Darksiders 3 does end up taking a different turn, which we will get there soon enough. So to me, combat is a clear step up, but what about the world that it takes place in? Darksiders 1 took place on a post-apocalyptic Earth, which did have some variety in its level design, and I highlighted how much I liked certain areas. But Darksiders 2 goes in a completely different direction. Death's journey takes him across multiple realms, all with different atmospheres. To start out, you've got your Forge Lands, this lush green realm inhabited by the Makers, which are basically these giant blacksmith creatures who were responsible for creating the realms we traverse through and so much more. I'll talk more about them in a little bit. Then there's the Kingdom of the Dead, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's dark, it's grim, and of course, it's full of undead. The variety here is honestly impressive, and each realm has its own visual identity and tone, and it keeps the game from ever feeling like you're stuck in one place for too long. There are some areas where I actually was surprised at how good things looked from a distance, but the bigger change is how these areas are structured. Darksiders 1 had a connected world, but Darksiders 2 opens things up into these large explorable regions. You can freely ride your horse named Despair through open fields, discover side dungeons tucked away off the main path, and pick up side quests as you see fit. It makes the world feel more alive and gives you a reason to actually explore instead of just running around from objective to objective. I will mention that some of the side content is fluff and there's a lot of padding in this game, but we'll dig into that soon. In general, I really enjoyed just how different this game felt from the first. It's more expansive and it just looks really good. The game also gives Death a much wider toolkit to get around. I mentioned the parkour system earlier, and it really is the backbone of how you navigate through these areas. Death can wall run across gaps, he can scale walls vertically and bounce between pillars to reach higher platforms. It's smooth and it makes traversal feel like its own gameplay layer rather than just getting from point A to point B. I will mention that just like the first game, there were some pain points, like Death just flat out missing grabbable ledges that were well within reach, and these sometimes made the platforming sections kind of annoying, but it didn't happen all that often. On top of that, you still get new abilities as you progress through the main dungeons, similar to how Darksiders 1 handled it. Early on, you get the Death Grip, which is basically a grapple that lets you pull yourself towards specific points or yank enemies towards you. Then there's the Soul Splitter, which lets Death split into two copies of himself to stand on pressure plates and solve puzzles simultaneously. And you also get the Void Walker back from the first game, so those portal puzzles do make a return. The puzzle solving in general is still a big part of the experience, but I'd say the puzzles in Darksiders 2 aren't quite as demanding or as complex as some of the ones in the first game. Those were on a completely different level. They're quite a chunk of time to solve. These are much more straightforward. I've been pretty positive about this game so far, but Darksiders 2 does start to show some cracks. The main quest has this structure where Death basically needs to find someone or something to help him resurrect humanity, but every time he gets close, there's another obstacle. You need to talk to this person, but first you need to prove yourself. To prove yourself, you need to clear this dungeon or defeat this boss. But to get into that dungeon, you need to find 3 keys. It's a lot of before you can do this, you need to do that. And it can start to feel like the game is padding itself out. I mentioned in my trilogy video that this game would probably be like 3 hours without all the padding that it has. Darksiders 1 had some of this too with the collectathon structure, but the first game was like a 12 to 15 hour experience, so it never really overstayed its welcome. Darksiders 2 on the other hand is pushing 18 to 30 hours depending on how much side content you do, and you really start to feel the bloat in certain sections. The side quests that I mentioned earlier don't help much in this department either. A lot of them boil down to fetch quests or clearing out a side dungeon for a reward. reward. While the loot you get from them can be worth it, the quests themselves aren't all that interesting from a narrative standpoint. The main dungeons, however, are still solid. Each one is built around whatever new ability you just picked up, and the level design within them is generally really well done. The mission design is something that's joked about in Darksiders 3. The collect X amount of items design really overstayed its welcome in this game, but it does get remedied in later titles. Despite the padding in the mission structure, one thing that kept me engaged was the enemy variety. Darksiders 2 throws a lot of different things at you across its different realms, and because each realm sort of has its own theme, the enemies that you encounter reflect that. In the Forge Lands, you're mostly dealing with corruption, this parasitic force that's infected the land and its creatures. And once you move into the Kingdom of Dead, the roster shifts to skeletons, wraiths, and undead that fight differently from what you're already dealing with. And in the later game, you start running into demons, angels, and constructs that demand even more of you in terms of combat awareness. I appreciated that the game kept introducing new enemy types as you move through each realm. Boss fights are also a step up from the first game in my opinion. Darksiders 1 had a few standout fights, but the majority of those boss fights in that game had a single gimmick that you needed to do over and over again. There's a real difference in the sequel here. Each boss fight feels more distinct. They're generally more challenging in my opinion, and just straight up one-on-one combat encounters without needing to learn some mechanic before being able to actually deal damage. There is a bit of that as well, I won't lie, but it's on a much lower scale. They do a better job at just creating a legit challenge. And the scale of some of these fights is really impressive too. There are genuinely massive bosses in this game that make for really great spectacle moments. All in all, I think the boss encounters were definitely a big step up from the first game. So let's close the gap on this story like we did with the first game. We already know that Death's goal is to resurrect humanity to clear War's name, but how he gets there is what moves the story along. It all starts with the Crowfather, also known as the Keeper of Secrets. See, there's some important backstory here that the game establishes. The Four Horsemen are actually the last of the Nephilim, a race born from the fusion of angels and demons who waged war on all of creation, specifically in Eden, an area that was meant only for humankind. The Horsemen were given power by the Charred Council in exchange for slaughtering their own kind. Death personally cut down the last of them, their leader named Absalom, earning him the title of Kinslayer. But Death couldn't bring himself to fully destroy his own people. He secretly preserved the souls of the Nephilim in an amulet and gave it to the Crowfather for safekeeping. This is a secret he kept from everyone, even his fellow horsemen. Death travels to the Crowfather looking for a way to reach the Tree of Life, which supposedly holds the key to resurrecting humanity. The Crowfather agrees to help, but only if Death takes back the amulet. Death refuses, and the Crowfather attacks him, transforming into a copy of War. Death kills the Crowfather, but with his dying act, the old man shatters the amulet and embeds the fragments into Death's chest. He then sends Death through a portal, and he wakes up in the Forge Lands. The Forge Lands are home to the Makers, these massive beings who are basically the architects of creation. They built the realms, they built the weapons, the constructs, basically all of it. And it's here where we learn about corruption. This dark force that's been spreading across dimensions and consuming everything in its path. The corruption has blocked off the Tree of Life, so Death has to help the Makers to clear it out before he can continue his own quest. When Death finally reaches the Tree of Life, he gets sucked inside and comes face to face with the source of the corruption, a shadowy form of Absalom, the very Nephilim leader that Death had killed himself. Absalom's hatred and rage is what birthed the corruption in the first place, meaning Death's inability to fully destroy his people is what caused this whole mess. The tree spits Death out into the Kingdom of Dead, where he learns that the tree alone cannot resurrect humanity. What he actually needs is the Well of Souls, a place where all dead souls are channeled and cleansed before being reborn into creation. To access the Well of Souls, Death needs two keys, one held by heaven and one held by hell. This sends him to an outpost of heaven called Lost Light, where he deals with the corrupt Archon, and then to Shadow's Edge, the demon realm. In Shadow's Edge, Death runs into some familiar faces. Samael makes a return and is also a boss fight here, and Death also encounters Lilith, a demon queen who claims to be the mother of all the Nephilim. She's the one who created Death's entire race, and she urges him to use the Well of Souls to resurrect the Nephilim instead of humanity. This sets up the central conflict of the ending. With both keys in hands, Death enters the Well of Souls and faces Absalom one last time. Absalom tells Death that he isn't the source of the corruption. Death is, because it was Death's betrayal and guilt that gave corruption its power. Death defeats Absalom and then faces the choice he's been dreading. He can either resurrect humanity to save War, or resurrect the Nephilim, his own people that he personally slaughtered. Death chooses humanity. he throws himself into the well, sacrificing his own life and destroying the Nephilim souls in the process. This epilogue ends up tying directly back to the ending of Darksiders 1, where War breaks the seventh seal and summons all four horsemen, death included. So Death's sacrifice isn't permanent, but in the moment, he fully believed it was. So where does Darksiders 2 land for me? It's a bigger game than the first one in almost every way, and in a lot of areas it works in its favor. The combat is faster and more satisfying, the loot system gives you a reason to keep engaging with every encounter, the environments are varied and genuinely impressive at times, and Death is an interesting character in his own right. The story also goes to some personal places with Death's guilt over the Nephilim, and the final choice at the Wall of Souls is a very strong ending. But Darksiders 2 also has a bloat problem that I just cannot ignore. The mission structure pads things out way more than it needs to be, the side quests are mostly forgettable, and there are stretches of the game where you can feel it spinning its wheels before letting you move forward. That said, I still had a great time with it, and I felt like it would be an experience that would be very hard to top. And I'll be ranking these games individually at the end of this video. With that being said, it's time to get moving to Darksiders 3. Oh boy. So Darksiders 3 released in November of 2018. 6 years after the second game. A lot of things happened in between. THQ went bankrupt, Vigil Games, the studio that developed the first two games, got shut down, and the Darksiders franchise was bought by Nordic Games, which is now known as THQ Nordic. Development was handed off to Gunfire Games, a studio founded by former Vigil employees, so the DNA is still there, but this is technically a new team working on it. This time around, we play as Fury. Like the first two games, Darksiders 3 takes place during that same time period. While War is imprisoned and Death is off doing his own thing, Fury is tasked by the Charred Council to hunt down and capture the seven deadly sins, who have taken a physical form and are running loose on Earth. Fury's personality is arrogant, impatient, and well, she's angry. Her character arc throughout the game is actually one of the more interesting aspects of the story, and we'll be getting into that a little bit later. So if Darksiders 2 was an expansion of the first game, Darksiders 3 is what I would consider a complete 180 from both of them. The first two games let you hack through groups of enemies without putting too much thought into it, but Darksiders 3 slows everything down for the most part. This is more of a Souls-like. Enemies hit hard, healing is limited, and you lose your leveling currency when you die, and you do have to go and pick it up, and button mashing without understanding the enemy's attack pattern will get you killed almost immediately. Now the game can be played in classic mode as well, which gives you a similar playstyle to the other games as far as animation interruptions go. I chose to play the game in default mode because it seemed like the intended experience because, well, it's called default. Fury's primary weapon is a whip, and the combat is built around timing your dodges and finding openings rather than stringing together flashy combos, although you can do that a little bit still. The loot system from Darksiders 2 is completely gone. There's no gear dropping from enemies, there aren't any randomized weapons. Instead, Fury gets new weapons tied to these elemental forms called hollows that she unlocks as the story progresses. The world structure is different too. Darksiders 1 had the connected map with serpent holes. Darksiders 2 had these more open regions that you can freely roam, but Darksiders 3 goes for something closer to the first game and a Metroidvania, so to speak. It's one big interconnected world with shortcuts that loop back on themselves, and you'll need specific hollow abilities to access certain areas. There are no dungeons in the traditional sense. There are some NPCs that hand out side quests, but the game is noticeably smaller in scope than the second one. So let's dig into combat a bit more because this is where Darksiders 3 is going to be most divisive. Like I mentioned, the whip is Fury's main weapon, otherwise known as the Barbs of Scorn, and has a decent range which helps in keeping some distance between you and the enemies. The whip can be upgraded bit by bit, and there are enhancements that can be equipped for passive bonuses like more damage or health regen, for example. But the real depth in the combat comes from the hollows. Each one gives Fury a completely different secondary weapon, which changes how she plays. The Flame Hollow gives her a pair of flails that are great for dealing damage up close. The Storm Hollow gives her a polearm with longer reach. The Force Hollow gives her a massive hammer that swings slow but hits pretty hard. And the Stasis Hollow gives her a sword. You can swap between these on the fly, and learning when to use which hollow against certain enemies is a big part of getting better at the game. Nailing a perfect dodge and following it up with an arcane counter is a pretty satisfying feeling, and when the combat clicks, it does feel decent enough. The problem is that I honestly think it's a big downgrade from Darksiders 2. Fury can feel sluggish at times, and there are moments where the hit detection does feel a bit off. The camera can also work against you, especially in tighter areas when you're fighting against multiple enemies. I don't know, there's something about about the approach to combat in this game that just didn't resonate with me all that much. It just felt sort of bland and uninspired. Maybe it's because I played this game right after Darksiders 2 and I really enjoyed that game's combat. Darksiders 3 just felt like a step back for one reason or another, and I can't really put my finger on it. Now let's talk about the environments because unfortunately this is one of the weaker areas of the game. Darksiders 3 takes place on Earth, similar to the first game, but it doesn't have the same variety in areas that you visit. In Darksiders 1 you had the distinct areas like the Twilight Cathedral, the Ashlands, Eden, places that all felt different from each other. In Darksiders 2 you're traveling across entirely different realms with their own visual identity. Darksiders 3 doesn't really have that. A lot of the game is spent in these boring and muted environments that kind of blend together after a while. The color palette is honestly pretty drab. It makes exploring feel less engaging because the areas you're moving through just aren't that interesting to look at. The level design is also a step down. The structure sounds good on paper, and there are some cool moments where you unlock a shortcut and realize how the world connects, but a lot of the areas themselves just feel so generic. You're running through caves and ruins and corridors that don't have a lot of personality to them. There are some really questionable areas like this one in particular where you have these tiny creatures who throw bombs at you and traps are placed all over the area. Easily one of the worst designed areas in any game I've ever played. Coming off Darksiders 2 where every realm felt handcrafted and distinct, this was a noticeable upgrade. Now the traversal mechanics tied to the hollows are decent. Each hollow gives Fury a different way to get around these areas. The Flame Hollow lets Fury jump higher, which is essentially a double jump. The Storm Hollow lets her glide through the air and reach platforms that are far away. The Forest Hollow turns her into a giant ball for some reason, allowing her to roll along magnetic surfaces on walls and ceilings, which honestly I found hilarious for some reason. And the Stasis Hollow lets her walk on water, which is actually pretty cool. So even though the environments themselves aren't all that exciting to look at, the way you move through them does change as you unlock more hollows, and going back to earlier areas with these new abilities to find things you couldn't reach before is kind of satisfying. As I mentioned, it has a similar setup to Darksiders 1, where unlocking new powers opens up inaccessible areas earlier on in the game. As for puzzles, they're pretty much stripped back compared to the first two games. Like I mentioned, Darksiders 1 was like 50% puzzles, Darksiders 2 still had a decent amount of them, but Darksiders 3 barely has any, and the ones that are there are very simple. I'm not the biggest fan of puzzle solving to begin with, so I was totally fine with that. So the mission structure in Darksiders 3 is probably the most straightforward of the entire franchise. Fury is basically told to go and kill the 7 deadly sins by the Charred Council, and that's basically it. There's no collecting 4 hearts, no finding 3 keys to unlock a dungeon, no proving yourself before someone will help you. Just go find the sins and take them out. The game gives you a general direction and lets you go free. Each sin serves as a boss fight, and the path to each one is essentially its own section of the world. It's a much more linear and focused structure compared to the first two games, and I think that works in the game's favor for the most part. The bloat that dragged down Darksiders 2 in my opinion just isn't here. There really aren't that many side quests to speak of, there's no loot to chase, and once you've cleared a section, there's not a ton of reason to go back unless you're hunting for collectibles. Alright, let's talk about enemies and the bosses because this is where the Souls-like influence really starts to show. The regular enemies in Darksiders 3 are tougher than anything in the first two games. Even basic enemies can kill you if you're not paying attention, and the game likes to throw new enemy types at you that force you to learn their patterns before you can actually take them down consistently. There are these insect-like creatures, there are demons, undead, angels, and so on, and these are all scattered through the different areas. A lot of these enemies do pose a good threat, and there are bigger versions of enemies that are harder to kill, but you do get rewarded for taking them down in the form of enhancements. Each sin that serves as a boss fight has a distinct personality, a unique design, and their own fighting style. Sloth, for example, is this giant bug creature that gets carried around on a throne. Greed is this fast-moving collector that hoards everything it finds, and I love this particular boss design. Wrath is just a straight up brawl. They all feel different from each other. Some of them are harder than others, obviously, but I don't think any of them felt unfair other than Gluttony. My goodness, was that one of the worst designed boss fights in modern gaming. You can check out my trilogy playthrough if you want to see that. Anyway, these fights are easily the highlight of the game for me. Alright, so let's get to the story. At the start of the game, Fury doesn't really care much about anyone but herself. The Charred Council sends her to hunt the 7 deadly sins, and she takes the job because she sees it as an opportunity to prove that she is the strongest horseman. She's not doing this out of loyalty or justice like war, or out of love for a sibling like death. she just wants the glory. The council, for some reason, also attaches a watcher to her, the same way they did with War. They seem to not trust Fury for some reason. What I found disappointing about the story to start was that it doesn't really tie into the meta story of the franchise, nor do we get some new backstory that we saw in Darksiders 1 and 2. I guess it's fair since the series is pretty established at this point, but Fury's story is more personal. When she arrives on Earth, she encounters and defeats the first sin, Envy, and takes her talisman, which she uses as a prison to absorb each sin after defeating them. Early on, Fury runs into Wrath, and during that fight, her horse Rampage is killed by an angelic blade. She's mortally wounded by Wrath, but before she dies, a portal opens up beneath her and she's pulled to safety by the Lord of Hollows, a mysterious and powerful being who gives her the Flame Hollow, the first of her new elemental powers. The Lord of Hollows also warns Fury that she's being manipulated by the Charred Council, but honestly, she's too stubborn to listen at first. Plus, she wants to be the leader of the Horsemen, so she really doesn't care all that much. Fury encounters Ulthane, the old one from the first game, who has built a safe haven for the surviving humans on Earth. He asks Fury to send any humans that she finds to Haven. After defeating Pride, the second to last sin, things take a turn. Pride reveals that the Charred Council had been betraying the balance from the very beginning. They released the sins on purpose, hoping that the sins and the horsemen would destroy each other. Fury's Watcher, the one who had been following her and reporting back to the council the entire time, reveals herself to be the real Envy. She's been in disguise the whole time, using Fury to absorb the sins into the talismans so that Envy can steal all the power at once. She strips Fury of her abilities and leaves her for dead. Fury is then saved by the very humans that she spent the game learning to care about, and this is where her arc sort of comes full circle. The horseman who started the game thinking humans were worthless is now being rescued by them. Ulthane reveals he's built a passage to the Charred Council, and Fury goes after Envy one last time. She defeats Envy in the council's chambers, and when the council tries to kill Fury to cover their tracks, she detonates the Talisman of Sin in their faces. Fury then returns to Earth and helps defend the humans as they escape through a portal to another realm and vows to protect them as their guardian. A human named Jones who had been helping throughout the game is actually Strife, one of the other horsemen in disguise. He's been keeping an eye on things the whole time, and just like the other two games, the ending connects back to the moment that War breaks the seventh seal, summoning all four horsemen to ride together. Right, so that's the story, but where does Darksiders 3 land for me? Honestly, to me, it's the weakest of the series so far. The Souls-like direction is an interesting idea on paper, but the execution just doesn't quite get there. The combat can feel satisfying sometimes, but it's entirely inconsistent. The environments are a noticeable step down from what came before. The world is smaller, the color palette is drab, and there's just less to do overall. Puzzle solving that was such a big part of the first two games is basically gone, and the Metroidvania structure doesn't make up for how uninteresting a lot of the areas are to actually explore. The boss fights against the 7 deadly sins are the highlights. Each one feels unique, and they carry the game in a way that the regular gameplay doesn't always manage to. By the end of it, I found myself wanting to get through Darksiders 3 more than I found myself enjoying it, and that's not something I can say about the first two games at all. It's not a terrible game, but coming off the back of two entries that each brought something special to the table, Darksiders 3 just didn't hit the same way for me. Last but very not least, we have Darksiders Genesis, which released in December of 2019. The franchise gets once again handed off to yet another studio. This time around, Darksiders was developed by Airship Syndicate, and Genesis is a prequel to the entire series, set before any of the other games. It's also a completely different kind of game. Gone is the third-person perspective that every other entry used. Instead, Genesis is a top-down action game. Think Diablo as a comparison. It also introduces the fourth and final horseman, Strife, who is playable for the first time in the series. You can swap between Strife and War on the fly, with Strife handling ranged combat through his dual pistols and War doing what War does best, which is up-close combat. The game also features co-op, another first for the franchise, but I ended up playing my way through the game solo. This time around, the Charred Council sends War and Strife to investigate Lucifer, who is suspected of granting power to master demons throughout hell in an attempt to upset the balance. Each level in this game is its own self-contained area that you select from a hub, so it's not an open world or in an interconnected map like the previous games. It's a completely different setup. You go in, you fight through enemies, you solve some puzzles, do some platforming, and usually fight a boss or a mini boss at the end. And it's a simple setup, but it worked really, really well for this game. Each level has a ton of secrets to discover and collect as well. And yes, the platforming is still here, but nowhere near to the extent that Darksiders 2 had. There's wall climbing, you can jump across gaps and sections where you need to use specific abilities to get around, and it can definitely be a little awkward with a camera angle at times. There were a number of moments I felt like I was perfectly lined up with a pole or a grabbable ledge, only to miss the landing completely. You're still getting new abilities as you go, and you'll want to revisit earlier levels with those new abilities to find secrets and collectibles that you couldn't reach before. Speaking of the hub, this is where Volgrim and a few other NPCs hang out. You can buy upgrades, swap out your creature cores, which I'll get into in a little bit, and just kind of prepare for the next mission. The levels themselves have a good amount of variety in terms of what they ask you to do. Some are more combat heavy, some lean more into puzzle solving, and some have these big set piece moments. Now let's get into combat because this is where Genesis really surprised me and I enjoyed it so much more than I thought I would. Having two playable characters that you can swap between at any time gives the combat a layer that none of the other games have. Strife is your ranged option. He uses the dual pistols and has different ammo types that you unlock as you progress. You've got your standard shots, but then you get things like charge shots or beam shots and gravity shots that all sort of change how you approach encounters. My personal favorite ended up being the static shot. The chain lightning effect was huge for clearing large groups of enemies in a breeze, and it was just so satisfying to watch. War plays exactly how you'd expect if you've played the first game. He's up close, heavy hitting, and has the Chaos Eater doing most of the work. The beauty of the system is that you're constantly switching between the two depending on the situation. It keeps the combat feeling dynamic in a way that a single character game just can't really replicate. I'll admit though, I spent the vast majority of my playthrough playing as Strife. I really liked his playstyle and I had my fair share of war from the first game as it was. I want to talk about the creature core system because this also acts as your progression. Enemies drop these cores that you slot into a grid, and each one provides different stat boosts and passive ability. The more cores you collect, the stronger you get, and there's a decent amount of customization in how you build out your grid. The grid affects both War and Strife, so balancing their power levels is a good challenge, and crafting the best build with a large amount of creature cores available was fun to mess around with. It also gives you a reason to replay levels and farm specific enemies, which is a nice touch. Now I want to get into the level design and the environments. As for the environments, Genesis is a nice looking game. The top-down perspective actually works in its favor here because the levels are designed to be visually dense and detailed in a way they can really appreciate from above. You've got these hellscapes with lava-filled caverns, you got frozen wastelands, demonic fortresses, and so on and so forth. It's a far cry from the drab palette of Darksiders 3. Each level does feel distinct from the last, so there's a nice variety, and it doesn't always feel like you're running through the same looking area twice. The level design is solid. There's a good mix of open combat arenas, tighter corridors, hidden paths, and just general verticality. The game heavily rewards exploration by tucking away collectibles, health upgrades, and creature cores in spots that you'll miss if you're just rushing to the objective. The mission structure in Genesis is pretty straightforward, and honestly, it's better for it. You pick a level from the hub, you go in, you complete it, and you can move on to the next one. You might need to go back and grind a bit if your power level is too low, or you can even jump to the arena and do a number of combat challenges for souls and creature cores. Because each level follows a similar formula of like fighting, puzzling, then fighting, and then you get to the boss, you definitely can start to feel the loop after a few missions in a row. However, I will mention that one of my favorite things about the game is the banter between War and Strife. The two are almost always communicating, filling the details of the ongoing narrative, or just messing around. I liked how Strife played the comedic relief role and often joking with War. War would either not reciprocate the attempt at a joke or simply just brush it off. It was a really fun dynamic that I hope we somehow see continue in Darksiders 4. It actually kept me playing the game more and more because the two characters made it so fun to play. Alright, so let's get into the story. Genesis takes place right after the Horsemen slaughtered the Nephilim on Eden. So War and Strife are basically still processing all of what happened when the Charred Council gives them their new assignment. Lucifer, the Demon King, is suspected of plotting with Samael to upset the balance, and the horsemen are sent to investigate. When they arrive at Samael's fortress, they find it under attack by another demon named Moloch. Samael quickly makes it clear that he is not working with Lucifer. In fact, Moloch's attack is happening because Samael refused Lucifer's offer. So Samael teams up with War and Strife along with Volgrim, and they all work together to track down the demon masters who are doing Lucifer's bidding. This sends War and Strife across multiple realms, hunting down demons like Mammon, Belial, and Dagon. They learn that Lucifer has found a way into Eden and are using its sacred artifacts for his own purposes. They also meet Abaddon here for the first time, the same angel who would later become the destroyer in Darksiders 1. After taking down Moloch with Samael's help, the dying demon reveals that Lucifer's plan is already complete and that Samael knows way more than he's letting on. What a surprise. Samael comes clean and explains what's really going on. Lucifer has offered power to the Masters of Hell in exchange for their souls after they die. Together with Lilith, Lucifer created an artifact called the Ammonus, fueled by the souls of demon masters that War and Strife had been killing all along. So the horsemen were essentially doing Lucifer's dirty work the entire time, taking out his rivals while powering his real plan. The Animus was used on Earth to corrupt mankind, introducing fear, hatred, and sin into humanity. When War and Strife arrive on Earth, they find the humans have already changed. They're violent and self-destructive. Lucifer appears to them as a possessed human child, telling them that the corruption of mankind is already spreading and cannot be stopped. The horsemen return to the Charred Council, and this is where the ending sets up the entire franchise. The council declares that humanity needs to be recognized and protected as a third kingdom. So they go on to forge the Seven Seals as a treaty between heaven and hell, and decree that whoever breaks the pact will face the wrath of the horsemen. And this sets the stage for everything that happens in Darksiders 1, 2, and 3. So where does Darksiders Genesis land for me? It might be the most pleasant surprise of the entire franchise for me. Going in, I wasn't sure how a top-down Darksiders game was going to work, but honestly, Airship Syndicate completely nailed it. The combat is really fun. The swapping between War and Strife keeps things dynamic the whole time. The levels are well designed and look really good, and the story does some heavy lifting for the franchise as a whole, setting up the events that unfold. It's not a perfect game, but for what it is, Genesis is a really fun experience. So now that I've worked my way through the entire series, I guess it's finally time to rank them. Each game plays differently from each other. Each game was made by a different studio, or at least a different version of each studio, and each game has its own strengths and weaknesses. Darksiders 1 is a solid foundation with a surprisingly great story and that classic Zelda-like structure with its dungeon mechanics. Darksiders 2 takes everything bigger with better combat, a loot system, a more open world, but struggles a little bit with bloat. Darksiders 3 swings for something completely different with its Souls-like approach, but it's a game that I honestly did not resonate with at all. And Genesis was by far the biggest surprise and easily one of the best games that the franchise has put out. So what does my final ranking look like then? Well, the worst of the Darksiders franchise, in my opinion, is Darksiders 3, so that'll take last place. In third place is Darksiders 1, and I need to mention that this is what the visual enjoyment graph would look like. There's a big difference between Darksiders 3 and 1. 1 is much closer to the rest of the games, let's put it that way. In second place would be Darksiders Genesis. I liked this game quite a bit, and I really enjoyed the banter between War and Strife. Overall, it was just a really fun game, a nice 12-hour playthrough that never felt like it overstayed its welcome. And finally, in my opinion, I think Darksiders 2 is the best game that the series has to offer. Let me know in the comments below if you agree with me or not. If you want to see me play through the entire trilogy, click the video on the screen. Thank you for watching. As always, consider